Morning. It's just about time. Welcome to Sunday morning Bible class. It's good to see everyone out and moving this morning. I don't know if we're going to have a big crowd or a small crowd. School will start back in session on Thursday here in Okaloosa County and in Santa Rosa County and in Escambia County. How about Walton County? Did they start back up? Yeah. So, mostly our people back. And that's a good thing. We may still have a few visitators. And that's okay as well. Anybody in here ever have a used car lot? I mean, you've probably been on a used car lot, but have you ever owned one? I know we have people who've owned grocery stores. Everybody owns a grocery store. And so I didn't want to talk about grocery stores this morning. I want to make sure that nobody owned a used car lot. So, previously owned cars. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, so we don't have anybody named Russell or Troy, I don't think. We got a Kelvin, but I don't think Kelvin had a used car lot. But Russell and Troy had been members of the same congregation for many years. And Russell owned a previously owned car lot, not a used car lot. Now, don't ask me if they were certified or not, because I can't answer that question either. But for some reason, Troy was avoiding Russell. And shortly after they started having a falling out, Russell had several customers who visited his car dealership and said, Troy's been telling people that you roll back odometers on your cars. Is that true? And about a week later, Troy opened up a used car lot across the street from Russell. Now, can't explain what happened. Don't know any of that kind of stuff, but, how would you feel? How would you feel when a brother opened up a business competing with you across the street after spreading some malicious gossip about your operation? Now, I don't know if it was malicious or not. I don't know if it was true or not. None of that stuff doesn't matter for the purpose of the story. But let's just say Russell and Troy got mixed up, got upset with each other. So, since they're members of the same congregation, you think it would be easier or harder to work out their differences? I don't know. It should be easier, but that doesn't always look that way, and sometimes things just don't work out the way we want it to. So, have you ever been upset with another church member? Most of us in here have been members of the church for a long time. Long time being more than few years. But you ever been upset with another church member? I have been. I've been upset with other church members. It's usually something pretty stupid. I get my nose bent out of joint for some weird reason, and it happens. Or have you ever knowingly upset another church member? Well, you may have, but did they say anything to you? What about your church, your earthly or physical family? You ever get upset with your spouse or your kids? I know that never happens. I understand that. We never get upset in our familial units. Well, I guess that's what we have to say. But in a close group relationship, sometimes it takes give and take to make things work. Sometimes we go along to get along. Sometimes we get our feelings hurt. Sometimes we hurt other people's feelings. All of us have done and said things that we wish we could undo. And so that's difficult. You know, in the passage we're going to talk about in Matthew 18, you know, Jesus talks about relationships, and he's given us a process to follow. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I've already figured out that I either had too much or not enough. So thinking I have too much, what was suggested is that I take the thing, break it down to the opening slides, the middle slides, and the end slides, and just do the beginning and the end, and cut the middle stuff out, and that would work. So if you see me flipping through slides quickly, you can just ignore that stuff. That was Dwayne's recommendation. Just to be fair, I want credit to be where credit is due, so we'll make sure that's fair. We're in Matthew 18, beginning in verse 15, and we're going to unpack this passage and we'll talk about this. It says, if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. Now, there are some passages here that we'll talk about what it says, but I'll get there in a minute. It says, if they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Somebody didn't have a very high opinion of tax collectors. But this is a process that Jesus outlined for dealing with ruptured relationships within the church. Jesus wanted relationships to be healthy, there's no doubt about that, but he never said it was going to be easy. In fact, in those 3 different steps, personal, few, and a church, which do you think would be the most difficult for somebody to take? I think sometimes the one-on-one is the hardest thing to do. The question is that if you can't do that, how serious is the issue? In other words, too many times the approach we take is, hey, you know, such and such bothers me pretty bad. What do you think I ought to do about that? You know, we've immediately made it more than just us. And so, you know, that's, you know, we've mucked up from the very beginning, because there's nothing in here that says, go talk to Shane about what Ken did to you. It doesn't say that anywhere. You know, it says, if I'm upset with Ken because I think something's not right, I go to Ken. But isn't it a lot easier to go to Shane? Make it Shane's problem too. Yeah. Share that. But then we just circumvented the whole process. But you know, in the world, what we would do is we would post something on Facebook telling the world how Ken upset you, and then we'd have it copied to our Instagram account, and while we're at it, we might as well feed that over to X or Twitter or whatever the name of that program is now. So and while we're at it, let's make a YouTube video documenting the whole thing. You know, somebody along the process would then censor it. and it would all be evaporated. It'd all be gone. So we don't have a problem, do we? Jesus requires the innocent or wronged party to take the initiative, I think. Now, it said, if your brother sins. Now, let me clarify something here, because some translations where it says, if your brother sins, they stick in against you. All right? The most reliable manuscripts don't include that, but for whatever reason, some of the translators felt, well, we ought to stick that in. So several of the mainline translations will have that, if your brother sins against you. So that would make the responsibility to initiate the discussion on the party of the person who, the party that person thought they had been wronged, or you've offended me, or you've done whatever it is. And I'm an isolated, thing. Not right. So if we find ourselves in that situation where we're upset with somebody, Jesus said, you deal with it. So if I'm upset with Ken, I need to go talk to Ken. Now, what happens if I decide to sit and wait for Ken to approach me and he hasn't got a clue I'm upset about something? Well, I'm just going to sit and stew. I'm going to think about it, and I'm going to think about how horrible a person Ken is, because he hasn't come to me to talk about the thing that he's offended me about that he has no idea. Yeah, that's what happens. And, so I'm getting mad and madder at Ken because he's not resolving this situation that's bugging me to death. I am really upset about it. And so, yeah. Well, Jesus says, go talk to that person, And it says, between the two of you. That's the first step. I need to go talk to Ken. Well, I'm scared of Ken. Well, it doesn't say, unless you're scared of Ken, then, take 16 other people with you. It doesn't say that. It says, go talk to him and keep it private, just between the two of you, as much as possible. Instead of blabbing and backstabbing and doing all those things, we already talked about those different means we can, And this is a process that is kind of what we consider reconciliation. I go to Ken, we talk about it, we try to reconcile our differences, and if we're able to do that, Jesus said, you have won your brother over. Now, we're not winning an argument. We're not trying to get even. He doesn't tell us to get a lawyer. There's so many things that you can think about here that, but what he says is use the resources of the church, Actually, I think this particular message in Matthew may have only been like the second time he actually talked about the church. But in Matthew 25, 25, and 26, it says, settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown in prison. Truly, I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. Now, that's in a situation where you're being taken to court for whatever the law, and so that's one passage. There's a passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, the first 6 verses. It says, if any of you has a dispute with another, do you dare to take it before the ungodly for judgment instead of before the Lord's people? Or do you not know that the Lord's people will judge the world? And if you are to judge the world, are you not competent to judge trivial cases? Do you not know that we will judge angels? How much more the things of this life? Therefore, if you have disputes about such matters, do you ask for a ruling from those whose way of life is scorned in the church? I say this to shame you. Is it possible there is nobody among you wise enough to judge a dispute between believers? But instead, one brother takes another to court, and this is in front of unbelievers. So what Paul is telling the church in Corinth is that you want to go fight your battles in court among the ungodly. You need to take your battles to the church, to your brothers and sisters, because that's where the true wisdom lies. And I think that's true. Now, all of us in here who have been in business in our lives have probably been involved in one way or another with the courts, whether we are there because we got a speeding ticket, or we're there because we're witnesses, or we're there because we're jurors, or most of us have somehow had some relationship with the court. And in those particular instances, I really probably can't bring it to church and say, I got a speeding ticket, Ross, can you get me out of it? You know? And Ross will say, no, I got 3 more myself. So, but truly, now I could have said David, and we know that wouldn't have been a fact, but honestly, we do have situations in our lives where we may have a tangle with the legal system, but with each other. And that's what Jesus is talking about. With each other, we need to be up front and deal with it. Let's take a couple more verses here. It says, truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. He says, again, truly I tell you that if 2 of you on earth agree about anything they ask for, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there am I with them. Now this almost doesn't seem to fit the previous few verses that we read, but most people, well, I don't know if that's true. I think we probably do know that. Unless we're willing to make our relationships with our brothers and sisters right, it will affect our relationship with God. I mean, I think we all realize that. If we don't work out our differences together among ourselves, we're never going to be able to do what God tells us to do. Now, we sometimes use that little verse in 20 to make a point that God is present even in extremely small gatherings. And while that's true, it's not really the context that they're talking about here, but it doesn't change the fact of the statement. It basically says that, wherever 2 or 3 gather. You're exactly.
Why would it just be 2 or 3?
Yeah.
In other words,
if you're by yourself, God is still with you. Yes. Yeah. So, we'll use that, but it's really, take it into context. It is, and basically what he's saying is, you got to work out your differences, and as few people that are involved in getting it done, that's the idea. We don't need a jury of 12 when 2 people can work it out. And that's really what Jesus is trying to say here. You're going to have differences with people. You're going to have differences with people in your church, in your small group. You got to work that out. You got to get it resolved, figure out what it is. That concept carries outside the walls of the church. Now, we could talk about a lot of different scenarios, but I will tell you that when you have an issue with somebody, it's a lot easier to work it out with that one person. Find a way to make it work. We can't always turn a blind eye. We can't always just ignore it. But, somehow we got to make it work. A couple generations ago, and maybe not even a couple, it was pretty common to look at this situation. If you have a problem, go to that brother. If it doesn't work, find 2 or 3 more brothers to go with you and approach that brother. If that doesn't work, then approach the church. That was actually happening more frequently 30 or 40 years ago than I see it today. It was not unusual to see somebody, we use the term disfellowship, words withdraw fellowship from somebody because of their actions or behaviors or those kinds of things. What do we see today from that perspective? How do we deal with that? But I don't see it as much today. Do you think it's because all of us are now perfect and we never offend each other and we never get under each other's skin? I never bother anybody more than once or twice a day. We,
Taking all this to a political correctness ties back in that, we're afraid to do anything to anybody because it's not politically correct, nor it's because it's not woke today.
So what Dwayne's saying is our society is kind of dictating how we're to behave, whether it's in political nature or whatever it is. Are those changes good or are they bad? I mean, I hate to think that we have lost touch with what we're required to do. And I hate to think that we can only find a way to resolve a problem within the court system, the legal system. But there's got to be a way that we can, as Christians, resolve issues as much as it is within our power. And I say that because I understand that there are extenuating circumstances. The problem is the extenuating circumstances usually got extenuating because we didn't do the right thing to begin with. And that's the real truth.
It seems to me one of the reasons why we don't see confrontation in the church like that is because it's too easy to go somewhere else. It's too easy to walk away. And so we won't confront somebody because it's easier to do something else.
That's an interesting observation. Now, Jeff is saying that it's too easy to go somewhere else. If I get my nose bent out of shape, well, then I'll just go across the street to this other group. Now, in my opinion, it would be very difficult for me under any set of circumstances to walk away from this group because I have I'm invested in all of you. And so you are my literal family. So, but I think it depends upon how long you've been around. I think it'd be easier for somebody who's only been around for a year to pick up and go somewhere else. But it would be very difficult for me to do that. And that's just my perspective. It may or may not be correct. But misery loves company, so I'd rather just make all of you miserable instead of walking away and making you less miserable. I'm going back here because I can't hear Betty when she talks.
I go back all the time. I go back and think about the church, and I've always been in church. We heard mostly the plan of salvation, instrumental music versus non-instrumental. Baptism, whether or not we're going to fellowship in the fellowship hall. It's, as I remember, we didn't go as far as we're going in Scripture to really study. We were dealing with these major issues. Plan of salvation, that was a big thing. Instrumental music was a big thing. Now, I think that had good points. We heard the Scripture, we knew where it came from. I don't think the young people, the kids today, know what we knew. But I believe that I never remember, which I don't remember a lot of things, but I don't remember studying this in a Bible class. We knew it was there, we knew it was important, but the greater importance the elders
So what Betty's saying is that her recollection is that the emphasis when she was younger and maturing in the church was that the plan of salvation, that was clearly taught. The things that were important to the leaders at that time had to do with following those steps, had to do with baptism. Some of it had to do with the type of singing that we do, the a cappella singing that we do, those different tenets. So what she's saying is the focus seems like it was different, that the stuff that we're talking about like this morning, there wasn't a lot of emphasis on that aspect of things. And so that's her recollection of what she remembers. And I remember some of that too, because, although Betty's at least 2 years older than me, I do remember a lot of those things. And so we get this, that's true, she is at least 2 years older than me. We get this idea that we know it all sometimes, and we don't need a refresher. The truth is that we forget more than we ever remember. And so, when's the last time you talked about this or talked about this? I mean, how often do we spend time talking about some of these scriptures in Matthew? Well, from a classroom's perspective, have we talked about them with an emphasis on the idea of forgiveness? Because that's really where this is going to boil down to. As a matter of fact, here's an interesting. Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times, or 7 times 70. It depends on the translation that you read. But the point is that there's not a limit extended on forgiveness. In other words, Jesus is saying, no, you're not going to count the number of times you're going to forgive somebody, because you're just going to learn to forgive. And you're going to take the person out of it and understand that forgiveness is the way you ought to conduct your life. In other words, we don't like everything that happens around us, and some people offend us, but once we've done everything we can do to reconcile it, we've got to forgive it. We've got to, get past that stuff, because we can't hold a grudge, because if you hold a grudge forever, that's going to create other problems. You just can't win by trying to continue to carry that grudge through life. I mean, yeah, we don't love to hate people. We just don't. We don't like that. We don't like to feel that way. Why did Peter ask that question? Do I have to forgive them 7 times, Lord? But now Peter, his question, it assumed that everybody else was going to sin against him. It doesn't take into consideration that he's going to sin. Tommy? Okay. So, yeah, that's basically, don't forget, there are none of us. Now, I know this is difficult. There are none of us in this room that are perfect. Every one of us have sinned. And whether we want to talk about it or not, it's a fact. It just is a fact. All right, let's read some more, because we're never going to get here. He says, therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. You've heard this story. And as he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him, some say 10,000 talents. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children, all that he had, be sold and repay the debt. Now, I don't know if you understand how big a debt this was, but let's just say it's $10 million. Now, where are you going to come up with $10 million right now? If he's going to wait for $10 million right now, he can go ahead and sell me and my family and everything that I have, and he'll still only have 39 cents. So, it ain't going to happen. Well, that's the kind of the situation it was with this servant. He didn't have 2 shekels to rub together. How he got into that much debt, I don't know. Clearly, the king or the master, they weren't watching their nickels very well. You know, at this, the servant fell on his knees before him and says, "Be patient with me, and I will pay back everything." There is no way. The servant's master took pity on him and canceled the debt and let him go. So he was forgiven this humongous debt, millions of dollars, as far as I'm concerned. It could have been $1,000, doesn't matter. You know, usually, Jesus, when he told a parable, it's something that could have happened. I'm not sure this parable is very realistic, to be honest with you, because I don't see how somebody could let somebody run up that kind of a debt. Oh, okay. Well, could be a liability issue, but the truth is that, you know, how could you let somebody run up that much debt?
It was on the previously owned chariot company. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. So there we go. You know, 10,000 talents was more than $10 million. That the king would even try to recoup the losses by selling the man into slavery and his wife and his children and his possessions. It would have, you know, it wouldn't even made a dent in that. And then they just canceled the debt. Okay. See you later. Everything's good. You don't owe me anything. That's unbelievable to me. Now, that is forgiveness. And as long as it doesn't come up again, it's forgiveness. I mean, that's beyond what anybody could think is reasonable or something that anybody could, really think they understand. That's just hard to believe. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. Still too much money. He grabbed him and began to choke him. "Pay back what you owe me," he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, "Be patient with me and I will pay it back." Does this sound familiar? But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. Now, these two stories are so dissimilar in the outcome and in the amount that we're talking about here. First of all, how do you think the guy's going to pay back the debt when he's sitting in prison? I have never figured this out. Yeah, put the guy in prison until he pays the debt. How's he going to pay the debt? You know? He's not. You're worse off than you were to begin with. It just doesn't work. But the real problem here is that this unforgiving servant had just had this huge amount of debt forgiven. And so the $10 million worth of, compared to the $100, there is no comparison. And he's going to have this guy thrown in jail till he can pay it back. And he will never pay it back. And this guy will forever be unhappy. But you know, has a way of coming back. He said when the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged. And they went and told their master everything that happened. Then the master called the servant and says, "You wicked servant, I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" You know, sometimes we don't learn from our mistakes. And truly, this was a monumental mistake on the part of this servant. First of all, to run up that kind of debt. Second of all, to decide, well, it was okay for him to go and after this guy to go get 100 silver coins. It doesn't make any sense. There is no reconciliation, Ken. Isn't that an interesting observation? Yeah. We have a debt we cannot pay. We even sing about it. But it's true. We have an obligation that we'll never be able to overcome. And because of that, this is a story about money, but it's not. This is a story about forgiveness. And so what did the guy do? He said in his anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. Again, how does that work out? He said, this is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. So what is he saying? That if we don't truly forgive other people, we will not receive true forgiveness ourselves. So that debt we cannot pay, that we owe an unfathomable amount, what does that mean? Well, in a nutshell, what it means is that we can't work our way to heaven. We can't work our way into solving that issue. And if we owed $10 million to somebody and they threw us in jail, we would not be able to work our way into resolving that. It isn't going to happen. Now, we have very high expectations of our fellow Christians. In other words, we expect a lot out of each other. I expect a lot out of you. I expect you to understand if I do something wrong and to rally together and come to my aid. And I expect you to never be upset with me for anything that I say or do to you, regardless of what it is. Now, that is a little bit of a hyperbole, but we have to know that realistically speaking, there will always be some misunderstanding among a group of people this long. When you put 200 people together, somebody in there is not going to always be happy. But we're not always going to know that you're not happy. I'm not going to know that Jerry's unhappy with me this morning because I said something wrong. And he's not going to tell me about it. Well, no, Jerry might. But we do have an obligation to each other. And because of the obligation we have very high expectations for one another. In Luke 17:3, I think I even have it. Yeah. If your brother sins, rebuke him, and if he repents, forgive him. And what does forgiveness mean? It means forgiven, forgotten, get past it. Don't dig it up 5 years from now. Oh, remember how I forgave you for that grievous sin you had 5 years ago? That doesn't work. That doesn't work. We got to forgive, and it's got to be so completely that okay, now, I'm going back here because Betty's got something important to say.
Should we not have high expectations? If I didn't have high expectations of Steve and Mike, they wouldn't be here today.
We should have high expectations for each other. And the new guy ought to have high expectations of me because he knows I'm a Christian. He has every right to expect that I'm going to have his back and that I'm going to do everything I can do to help him, just as I would expect him to help me if I was in a similar situation. In other words, by the very fact that we are a Christian family, I expect you to take care of me. I also expect you to correct me when I'm wrong. I just expect that. And that's the kind of expectation I have. And that is a very high expectation because it puts you on notice that I'm saying, hey, if I misbehave, you need to make sure I know it. Even if it upsets me. you know. But if I'm doing something I shouldn't be, I ought to be upset, and I ought to want to fix it, you know. God really is made for our forgiveness conditional on our willingness to forgive other people. What good does it do to carry a grudge? I think we've talked about that already. You know, it's not a very healthy way to do business. So what Tommy's basically saying is that, you know, we shouldn't judge the whole group based upon the failure of one or two, or that perceived failure of one or two, which is why Jesus talked about this in the first place. If you got a burr under your saddle because of this one person, you need to go work it out with that one person. You can't hold the whole church hostage because you're upset with one person. It doesn't work that way. So although our expectations are high, you know, we have a high expectation that we'll take care of each other, and that's on an individual level, but I think there's also an expectation on a church level or a group level as well. But carrying a grudge or getting so upset about somebody that we're willing to just continue to let it eat away at us, that doesn't work. It just doesn't work. It makes us bitter, and bitter people are not good people to be around. It just doesn't work. This passage is so important. Okay, so I got to wrap it up. I'm so sorry. It's interesting because it's time. You know, if we want to be right with God, you know, we got to do what we can do to make up our relationship issues. You know, and if we want to be independently spiritually healthy, God's grace needs to be seen through us without any doubt whatsoever. Next week is the last class in this series because the following week is the Ecuador report. So you're going to get slammed next week with a whole lot of extra work, and I apologize for that. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for allowing us to be together. We ask, Father, that you will bless us and help us to love each other. Give us a forgiving heart. Help us to accept your grace and to extend grace to others around us. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.